Imagine discovering that the man you loved, the man you thought you knew, was living a deadly double life. A secret affair that ends in tragedy, betrayal that cuts deeper than you could ever imagine. This is the true crime story of a marriage shattered, a life lost, and a woman's desperate search for revenge. Stay with us till the end as the shocking twists unfold and the truth comes to light, just when you least expect it. It was a cold, foggy night when Henry slipped out of his house, the sound of his footsteps barely audible against the damp ground. His heart raced as he made his way down the narrow, dimly lit street. The streetlights flickered sporadically, casting long shadows that seemed to follow him. His breath came in shallow bursts, visible in the chill of the air. Henry's mind was clouded with guilt, but it didn't stop him. The weight of his secret affair gnawed at him, but the thrill of sneaking away, of feeling alive again, overshadowed the guilt. The woman waiting for him was someone he hadn't seen in years. Lily, his former lover. Their relationship had ended when he married, but something about Lily's presence had always lingered in his mind. The years hadn't dulled their connection. Henry had met her again, secretly, just a few months ago. Now, tonight, they would meet again. As he approached her apartment, the tension in his chest grew unbearable. He knocked twice. The door opened, and there she stood. Lily, looking just as she did all those years ago. Beautiful, untouchable, and full of desire. The air between them crackled with a dangerous energy. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Come in," she whispered. Inside, the apartment was warm, the dim lighting soft and inviting, but something felt off. Henry stepped inside, his pulse quickening. Lily's eyes were fixed on him, dark with something he couldn't quite place. A strange unease crawled up his spine. Something wasn't right. The door closed behind him, locking them in. As they sat, talking quietly, the air grew heavier. Lily moved closer, her scent intoxicating, yet there was a coldness in her touch. Henry felt a shiver run through him. This wasn't the passionate reunion he had imagined. It was something more sinister. Suddenly, Lily's voice cut through the silence. "You're late," she murmured, her eyes narrowing. Henry frowned, confused. He had arrived right on time. Then he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible click from behind him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He turned, but no one was there. Only the sound of his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears. Lily watched him intently, a faint, unsettling smile on her lips. "Did you think you could get away with it, Henry?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. Henry froze, the words sinking into him like daggers. Something was terribly wrong. The air seemed to thicken, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Lily stood up, her movements deliberate and slow. She walked over to a small table, her fingers trailing along its surface. Henry watched her, unable to tear his gaze away. The sound of something sharp scraping against the wood made his skin crawl. Lily turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "Do you remember that night, Henry?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper now. His mind raced, but the memory was clouded. "Which night?" he asked, his throat dry. "The night you chose her over me," she said, her voice hardening. Henry's stomach churned. He could see it now, the darkness in her eyes, the bitterness that had festered over the years. "You think you can just walk away from me, from what we had?" she hissed. Lily's hand suddenly darted toward the drawer next to her, and Henry's heart skipped a beat. He took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. But it was too late. Lily pulled out a knife. The blade gleamed in the dim light. Henry's body froze, his mind racing. His pulse hammered in his ears, louder than anything. "Please," he begged, but the words felt useless. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lily's smile twisted into something dark and twisted. "I didn't just call you here for one last night, Henry," she said, her eyes cold. "I called you here for a final goodbye. The blade glinted menacingly in her hand as Lily took a step closer to him. Henry's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind spinning. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his chest. This wasn't the reunion he had imagined. This wasn't passion, it was something far more terrifying. "Lily, please," he stammered, his voice shaking, but his words seemed to fall flat. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, her gaze lingered on him, studying him as if he were an insect to be observed before the kill. "You thought I would just let you go?" she whispered. "You thought I wouldn't feel the betrayals?" Henry's chest tightened, each breath harder to draw. Lily's smile remained, but it was twisted, as if she were enjoying every moment of his fear. She stepped closer again, the sharp edge of the knife gleaming, catching the light. Henry's legs felt weak beneath him, his mind racing for any way out. But there was nowhere to run. No escape from the darkness that seemed to envelop the room. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating him. "I was the one who loved you," Lily continued, her voice low and chilling. "And you abandoned me. For her." She waved the knife between them as if to emphasize her words. "You took everything I gave you and threw it away." Henry shook his head, pleading silently for some way to make this stop. But there was nothing he could say. The terror in his eyes mirrored the coldness in Lily's. He could see the anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior, a rage that had been building for years. "You had your chance," she said quietly, her voice almost sad now. "But you chose the safe life." The life with her? Her eyes flickered for a moment, and something dark passed across her face. Henry's heart skipped a beat, his body trembling. Lily's grip tightened on the knife. It was then that he realized he wasn't just in danger of losing his life. He was losing everything. His past. His choices. And in that moment, Henry understood the true weight of his actions. He had walked into this apartment thinking he could handle it, thinking he could control the situation. But it was all out of his hands now. Lily was the one in control, and she had no intentions of letting him leave. Without warning, she lunged forward, the knife flashing through the air. Henry's body moved instinctively, but it was too late. The cold steel met his skin. A searing pain shot through his side. He gasped, feeling the blood begin to seep out. Everything felt slower now. His vision blurred. Lily stood over him, her face emotionless. "Goodbye, Henry," she whispered. Her voice was like ice. The darkness began to close in around him. He felt the weight of it all, the guilt, the fear, the regret. It was suffocating. Lily's face blurred, but he could still hear her voice. It was the last thing he would ever hear. The final breath he took was filled with a haunting, bitter understanding that he had, at last, paid the price for his choices. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in tighter with each breath Henry struggled to take. His body was growing heavier, the pain in his side throbbing more intensely with every passing second. He could feel the warmth of his blood pooling beneath him, slick and cold against the floor. His vision blurred, the edges of his sight fading to darkness. Lily stood over him, her presence unwavering, like a shadow he couldn't escape. She didn't move. She just watched him, her eyes cold and unfeeling. Henry's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest heaving as if fighting to cling to life for just a moment longer. His mind raced, thoughts crashing against each other like waves on a rocky shore. He could barely focus, but there was one thought that stood out through the haze of his pain. And his wife. He had betrayed her. But it was too late now. Too late for anything. The warmth of his blood was turning cold, his pulse slowing with each heartbeat. Henry's body was giving in, surrendering to the damage Lily had done. The world around him seemed to fade, distant voices filling his head, but nothing felt real anymore. Only Lily's figure remained, looming above him. And then, the last flicker of life in him began to flicker out. His eyes fluttered closed, unable to fight anymore. But just before everything went black, he heard Lily's voice once more. "Rest, Henry," she whispered, her words floating through the dark air like a final lullaby. Her voice was quiet, almost too soft to hear. "You thought you could escape me." And with that, the darkness swallowed him whole. The apartment was eerily still, save for the faint, rhythmic sound of Lily's breathing. She stood there for a long time, staring at the lifeless body of the man who had once meant everything to her. Her expression was unreadable, like a blank canvas. But there was something in her eyes. Something dark. Something final. The knife, slick with his blood, glinted in her hand. She turned away from him, stepping over the body like it was nothing more than an inconvenience. The door creaked open behind her, and Lily stepped into the night, leaving everything behind. In the silence that followed, Henry's body remained, a cold reminder of the secrets, the lies, and the ultimate betrayal. It was over now. The apartment was silent, save for the faint echo of Lily's footsteps as she disappeared into the night. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the street in a dense, suffocating mist. The world seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for something. Henry's body lay still, an unspoken testament to the tragedy that had unfolded. The blood, dark and still, soaked into the floor beneath him. It was only a matter of time before someone found him, before someone noticed his absence. But Lily was gone, slipping into the shadows as effortlessly as she had come. Back at the house, and sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. She had been waiting, as she always did when Henry was late. Her mind wandered to the troubling thoughts she had pushed away earlier that day. Something about Henry's recent behavior had unsettled her. The late nights, the strange phone calls, the sudden distance. But she had never suspected this. The thought of Henry out there, in the arms of someone else, twisted in her gut, and rose and walked toward the kitchen, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was all in her head. But then a knock at the door, and froze. Her heart skipped a beat. Who could it be at this hour? Her hand trembled as she opened the door, expecting the face of her husband, or perhaps a neighbor. But the person standing in front of her wasn't Henry. It was a police officer. "Mrs. Thompson?" the officer asked, his voice low and serious. "We need to talk to you." Anne's heart stopped. The dread in her chest spread like wildfire. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice shaking, though she already knew. The officer didn't answer at first. He only looked at her with sympathy in his eyes. And then, softly, he said, "We found your husband, Mrs. Thompson. He's dead." The world tilted beneath her feet. Anne's mind went blank. Her husband, Henry, was gone. The officer spoke again, but his words blurred into a hollow echo in Anne's ears. She couldn't hear him, couldn't comprehend it. The man she loved, the man she trusted, was dead. And there, deep in the pit of her stomach, a cold, terrible truth settled. Lily. She knew it, and felt the bile rise in her throat, the weight of the betrayal crashing down on her. Somewhere, in the depths of her heart, she had always known. But now it was real, and there was nothing she could do to change it. The officer's voice was distant now, muffled by the roaring in her ears. Anne stared at the floor, the world spinning out of control. The night had begun with uncertainty, and now it would end in heartbreak. For Henry was gone, and the truth, dark and twisted, was finally out in the open. Anne stood frozen, her mind unable to process the words the officer had spoken. Her chest tightened, and a deep, aching nausea settled in her stomach. The officer's presence seemed so out of place in the quiet house. His footsteps echoed in the stillness, but Anne couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The life she had known, the life she had built with Henry, was shattering before her eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, we need you to come with us," the officer said gently, his tone soft, as if he were trying to comfort her. But no comfort could reach her now. Henry was dead. The man she had married. The man who had promised her everything. It felt unreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. And nodded numbly, her legs barely supporting her as she followed the officer outside. The night was colder than before, the chill biting into her skin. The world outside seemed so distant now, so foreign. The fog hung thick in the air, and the sound of distant sirens made everything feel even more surreal. As they arrived at the scene, Anne's heart pounded in her chest. The sight of the apartment building, dark and looming in the mist, made her stomach churn. She didn't want to see it. She didn't want to know what had happened. But she had to. She had to understand. The officer led her through the building, up to the door where they had found Henry. Inside, the apartment was eerily quiet, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards underfoot. Anne felt her breath catch in her throat as she stepped into the room. There on the floor was Henry, cold, still. The blood was everywhere. A pool of dark red, now dried and lifeless, staining the wooden floor. Anne felt the room spin around her, the walls closing in. Henry's lifeless body was a cruel reminder of the nightmare she had never wanted to wake up from. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, her vision blurring with tears. The officer stepped back, giving her space, but Anne could barely register his presence. Her mind was numb, the grief overwhelming. But there was something else gnawing at her. A question. A dark suspicion. Lily. She couldn't shake the image of Lily from her mind, the woman who had once been Henry's lover. The woman who had never truly left him. Anne stood slowly, her body shaking. She glanced around the room, the strange, unsettling feeling settling deeper in her chest. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the blood. It wasn't just the violence. It was the way it all felt, planned. Anne's breath hitched as she pieced it together. Lily had been here. The thought was a jagged shard in her heart. Henry had been having an affair, and now he was dead. The officer began speaking again, his words a blur in the background. Anne's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the night. She had always felt something was off with Henry. The late nights, the whispered conversations, the distant looks. And now it all made sense. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Lily had taken him from her. And now Henry was gone. But Anne wasn't sure if she felt anger or relief. She had lost everything. And yet, part of her knew, deep down, that she would never truly know the truth. Not the way Lily would. Not the way Henry had. She was left to pick up the shattered pieces of a life she thought she understood. But nothing made sense anymore. And the darkness, thick and suffocating, was all around her. Anne stood motionless, her thoughts tangled in a web of grief and confusion. The air in the apartment felt cold and oppressive, like it was pressing against her chest, making it harder to breathe. She glanced down at Henry's lifeless body again, her mind screaming in protest, but there was no escape from the cruel reality. She was standing in the room where his life had ended, where his betrayal had come to its bloody conclusion. The officer stepped closer, his voice gentle but insistent. "Mrs. Thompson, we need to ask you a few more questions. It's important." Anne didn't respond immediately. Her mind was elsewhere, trying to process the surreal nature of the situation. She could barely comprehend the officer's words. Everything had shattered. Her marriage, her trust, her life. I need to know what happened," Anne finally whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling with a mix of anger and helplessness. The officer nodded, but his eyes were filled with an empathy that only made Anne feel more isolated. "It seems," he began cautiously, "that there was a struggle. The wound on your husband indicates that it was personal." Anne's heart skipped a beat. "Personal?" she repeated, barely able to form the word. He paused, watching her closely. "We believe the perpetrator knew your husband," he said quietly. "And the scene, it was staged, Mrs. Thompson. It wasn't a random act of violence. The implications of his words hit, and like a punch to the gut. She could feel her chest tighten as the truth clawed at her. Lily. Anne's mind flashed back to the memories. The odd silences when Henry came home late, the secretive messages, the way his phone had always been on silent, hidden from view. It had all been a lie. Her instincts had been right, but she had ignored them. She had wanted to believe in Henry's love, in their life together. But now, the pieces were falling into place. The officer's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts again. We've already contacted a few people who may know more about your husband's recent activities. We'll investigate this thoroughly, and nodded absently, not fully registering his words. She didn't need the officer's investigation to know what had happened. She knew. The anger was boiling inside her, rising like a tidal wave that threatened to consume her. But then, a strange calmness swept over her. The chaos, the pain, the betrayal, it all felt like a distant storm, something happening outside of her control. Anne stared at Henry's body once more. He was gone, and there was nothing she could do to bring him back. But what about Lily? That woman had been the catalyst for everything. She had taken Henry from her, twisted him with her lies and manipulations, and didn't know what she would do when she found her. But she knew one thing for certain. She would find her. Lily's face haunted her every thought now. Anne had to confront her. She had to make her understand the depth of the pain she had caused. The officer finally broke through Anne's reverie, his voice louder this time. Mrs. Thompson, we need you to come with us. We're taking you to the station for a formal statement, and looked at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't answer immediately, her gaze drifting toward the exit. Then, with a slow nod, she followed the officer out of the apartment, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had lost. The night was still thick with fog as they made their way back to the car. And as Anne climbed into the back seat, her thoughts were consumed by a single question. What had Lily truly wanted? What had driven her to kill Henry? Anne's fingers clenched into fists, the desire for answers burning brighter than the pain. The investigation had only just begun. And for the first time in a long time, Anne knew that she was no longer just a victim in this tragic tale. She was a part of it. And she would make sure Lily paid for what she had done. The car ride to the station felt like an eternity. Anne sat in the back seat, her hands gripping the cold leather, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions she couldn't yet answer. The officer driving remained silent, his focus on the road ahead, leaving Anne to wrestle with her thoughts in the oppressive quiet of the car. She kept replaying Henry's face in her mind, cold, lifeless. And then Lily's face, the woman who had stolen everything from her. The officer glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his gaze soft but purposeful. He didn't speak, but his eyes seemed to say, I know this is hard. We'll get through this. And felt a strange sense of detachment, like she was floating just outside herself. Her thoughts were jumbled, yet focused at the same time. It wasn't just about Henry anymore. It was about understanding the twisted puzzle that had led to this moment. Why had Lily done it? What had driven her to murder the man she had once loved? And why, after everything, had Henry still gone to her? The questions gnawed at Anne, each one more agonizing than the last. When they arrived at the station, Anne was guided through the cold, sterile halls, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder than usual, adding to the tension that clung to the air. She was ushered into a small interrogation room, the chair uncomfortable beneath her, the coldness of the walls pressing in on her. The officer sat across from her, his expression professional but compassionate. Mrs. Thompson, he began, we've made some progress on the investigation. We've spoken to a few people who had close contact with your husband recently. We're piecing it together, but there are still gaps. Anne nodded absently, her eyes unfocused. The officer paused, clearly waiting for her to respond, but Anne had no words left. Everything felt too much, too overwhelming. Instead, She simply stared at the table in front of her, her mind spinning. There was one thing she had to know. Do you think Lily was planning this all along? She asked softly, her voice almost breaking. The officer hesitated, his brow furrowing. It's hard to say for sure, but it seems like it. We found evidence that indicates she was in contact with your husband in the days leading up to the murder. She was clearly still very involved in his life. In some way, Anne's heart sank at the confirmation. She had known, deep down, that it wasn't just a casual affair. It had been something far more dangerous, far more consuming. She clenched her fists in her lap, the reality of it all settling over her like a heavy, suffocating weight. The officer continued, "We're still working to track her down. We're looking at surveillance footage, witness statements. We'll find her." But Anne didn't need the officer's reassurances. She already knew what she had to do. The darkness that had settled in her heart since Henry's death had begun to twist into something far darker. She couldn't sit by and wait for justice to play out. Not when Lily was still out there, alive, free, and unpunished. And stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. The officer looked up, surprised by her sudden movement. "I need to find her," and said, her voice low and cold. "Mrs. Thompson," the officer began, and cut him off. "I don't care what you do. I need to know where she is." The officer's face hardened slightly, his eyes narrowing in concern. "Listen, we understand your frustration, but you can't go after her yourself. This is a criminal investigation. We'll handle it." Anne's gaze was steely, determined. "I'm handling it," she said, her voice quiet but deadly. Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and walked toward the door, her movement sharp and purposeful. The officer called after her, but Anne didn't stop. She had a single goal now, Lily. She wasn't going to wait for the law to catch up, and knew she had to find her own answers, and she would go to any lengths to get them. The cold night air hit her as she stepped outside the station, the fog still heavy in the streets. Her mind was clear now, more focused than ever. She would find Lily, and when she did, she would make her understand the cost of betrayal. Anne's heart pounded as she moved through the streets, the cold air biting at her skin, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. The fog wrapped around her like a shroud, thick and suffocating, but it did little to cloud her resolve. Every step she took was driven by the need for one thing: closure, revenge. Her mind was consumed with the thought of Lily. She had to find her. There was no other option. The police, the investigation, they were too slow, too cautious, and didn't have the luxury of time. She couldn't stand still while Lily walked free, while the woman who had shattered her life remained untouched. Her hands clenched into fists, the cold seeping into her bones, but nothing could numb the fire burning within her. She had never thought of herself as vengeful, but in that moment, all that mattered was the quiet satisfaction of knowing Lily would pay. For Henry, for Anne, for everything that had been taken from her. Anne's phone buzzed in her pocket, the sound startling her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out quickly, half expecting it to be the police with some new update, but it was a text message from an unknown number. "I know what you're looking for. Meet me. 11th and Pine, midnight. Come alone." A chill ran down Anne's spine. It was strange, unsettling, but something inside her clicked. This was it. This was her chance. She didn't hesitate. By the time she reached the intersection at 11th and Pine, the fog had thickened even more. The streetlights cast faint, eerie pools of yellow light on the wet pavement, the world dim and hazy around her. She felt the presence of someone waiting, watching, but there was no sign of Lily, just the empty street and the shadows that danced along the buildings. Minutes passed, then an hour, and still no one came. Anne's stomach churned. The text had led her here, but the wait felt like a cruel game. She wasn't going to back down, not now. But as the fog shifted again, and felt a movement behind her. A presence. And when she turned around, she saw Lily. Not a step away. Anne's pulse quickened. This was it. The confrontation had begun. The fog hung thick in the air, curling around the streetlights, casting long, uncertain shadows across the empty pavement. Anne's breath caught in her throat as she turned, her eyes meeting Lily's with an intensity that seemed to freeze the moment in time. Lily stood there, her expression unreadable, her eyes cold and distant, just like the last time Anne had seen her. But there was something different in her gaze now, a sense of finality. Anne didn't speak at first, just stood there, the anger and pain swirling within her like a storm. It felt as though everything in her life had led to this moment. The betrayal, the loss, the murder, all of it. Lily didn't move. She only watched Anne, her lips barely curling into something that resembled a smile. It was a smile that sent a shiver down Anne's spine. "You've come for answers," Lily said softly, almost in a whisper. "But you already know, don't you? You know why I did it." Anne's throat tightened, her hands trembling at her sides. "You killed him," she said, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You took everything from me?" Lily's eyes flickered with something. Regret, perhaps, or maybe just cold calculation. "He never belonged to you, and he was never yours. He was mine long before you ever knew." The words stung, sharper than any knife, but Anne didn't flinch. "He wasn't yours to take," she replied, her voice steady now, the fire in her chest burning bright. Lily took a step closer, her gaze never leaving Anne's. "Do you think I wanted this?" she asked, her voice almost mocking. "Do you think I wanted him dead? I didn't. But there was no other way. I tried to get him to leave you, but he couldn't. You were in the way. You always were." The weight of her words hit Anne like a physical blow, but there was no time to process them. No time to react. Lily's hand moved to the pocket of her jacket and Anne tensed, a flash of fear igniting in her gut. But instead of a weapon, Lily pulled out a folded envelope, the paper worn and faded, as though it had been carried for a long time. Anne took a step back, her eyes narrowing. "What is this?" Lily held the envelope out, her fingers trembling just slightly. "A confession," she said simply. "For everything. For him. For you." And hesitated, then reached for the envelope, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. Inside there were photographs, pictures of Henry, taken over the past few weeks. He had been meeting Lily, not just for the affair, but for something more sinister, something Anne had never suspected. The pictures chronicled a secret, dark pact between Henry and Lily, one that involved far more than just love and betrayal. The truth was worse than Anne could have imagined. It wasn't just an affair, it had been a dangerous game, a secret conspiracy that had led to Henry's murder. Anne's vision blurred as the weight of it settled in. She felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Lily had done what she had done out of necessity, not love. And now, the truth was out. Anne closed her eyes, the darkness around her closing in, but she felt something deep within her. A quiet, heavy release. It was over. The game was finished. There was nothing more to say. Anne stepped back into the mist, the truth settling in her bones like a final, unshakable weight.